Hey everyone, Enzo speaking. So today I'm going to talk to you about building great product with data, which is one of my really favorite topic at the moment. So my name is Enzo. I'm a former product manager at N26, Zalando, and Intercom. And so in the past couple of years, I've basically experienced what it is to work in three different stages of companies. So a startup, a very enterprise stage, and then a more scale up. And so along these years, I've basically experienced what it is to have, set up like analytics setup, which are more or less advanced, or work with companies which are kind of like more or less, data driven. And what I've figured out is that the biggest companies don't necessarily have the best setup, but it's more of a mindset that is kind of like very, very great to get to justify decisions and reach higher success. So this is the topic of today. I want to share how to build this more data-driven, organization, and how you can do that at your individual scales with a couple of, very basic tips, tricks, and frameworks. So hopefully you get value from that. So the first question, and this is going to be really the red line of today, is why should you instrument your data, and how should you instrument your data? So I found this question especially hard to answer, and I get often the questions from the younger product manager I talk with. I find it hard to answer because there's just so much noise in the industry. There are just so many solutions, so many white papers, so many talks like the one I'm doing today. So really the purpose of today is to try to help you cut through the noise and understand the few things that you could start to put together today. So I really like what Brian Belfort says about, the analytic world. It's basically a world where people spend even more time analyzing the tool or finding, the right solution than they actually spend instrumenting and updating their data and reading their data. And this is because, again, it's all around. It's very, it's very popular. But once you get your hands into the weeds, it becomes quite complex. So today, I suggest that we try to cut through that BS and just follow some simple steps that get you and yield you some results. A couple of problems I'm going to try to answer today is I found a lot of companies that are advised to spend really hours implementing tons of events, but that they barely use or they barely are aware of it. I found companies to struggle with their, tracking analytics over time, or it becomes this massive black box that piles up, and finding an event is really like finding a needle in a haystack. The next step when you start to track your product is that you need to keep track of it, and this is where documentation kicks in. And the current solution that are very tempting to use can be super time consuming and outdated. So I'm going to share a few tips for you not to fall into this trap. And last but not least, I'm going to share about the latest visualization trend and how to avoid to build dozens of dashboards that you barely use. A small caveat I mentioned, I'm a former PM. I'm actually building a new product called June. June is a new version of a new analytics. It's a no-code analytics, rethink, a simplified version of product analytics, the way I think it should work. If you're ever interested to hear me again or hear about June in the future, you might just follow the link bit.ly/no-code analytics. So this is the framework we're going to go through today. 3 simple steps. The first step is how to move from goals to metrics to tracking. The second step is going to be about the 3 stages you can follow, which are really easy to get to your analytics epiphany in your company, in your team. And the third is going to be more an open and reach broader successes. So let's get started on the first framework, which is how to get started from goals to metrics to tracking. So first, goals. So the analytics world starts really with goals. The things that you want to measure, the business goals that you want to measure. And the first thing you can ask yourself is, what are the company goals that you have? What are you trying to achieve? For instance, A company goal could be that you want more customers, right? Or another company goal could be that you want your customers to spend more on average. An easy way to also think about goals is sub goals, right? You may take the first goal, which is that you want more customers. You may have two ways to get there, right? More people to find your product, or more people that find your marketing website, whatever, to turn into proper customers. So the first goal could be about increasing the traffic that you have on your website, while the second sub goal would be about increasing the conversion rate from the people that land on your website. So now that you have a business goal, and this is not really something I can advise today, and I'm pretty sure you're part of an organization that do, then the 1 billion question becomes, how do you reach these goals and what's the relationship with analytics? So this is where metrics enter in place. Metrics are the very measurable actions that the user can take inside your product that aligns with your goal. So they must be actionable. A metric gives you an information that allows you to make a decision. They're also tailored to your product. They help you to understand, what success means. And we're going to see that later. The good metrics are usually analyzed by cohort or by segmentation. So let's take a basic example. Let's say your goal is to increase your number of customers. Then one of the metrics you may use is increasing the number of customers that land on your website, but then turn into customers. This is called the conversion rate, right? I'm pretty sure you heard about it. This is a great metric that's aligned with the goal mentioned there. So the one question that I hear a lot is, how many metrics do you need, to measure the success of a release or a new product or new feature release? The advice there is really start small. There is no risk in starting too small, but there is a risk in starting too big. So a good advice I got from a mentor a couple of years ago is to start with a primary metric and a secondary metric. So a primary metric is the overall success indicator, such as the conversion rate that we just saw. The secondary metric is meant really to validate the smaller design decisions or the smaller adjustments, the health kind of of the things that you've pushed to the world. So if we go back to our example where our goal is to increase the acquisition by 10%, our primary metric may be the conversion rate. And the secondary metric may be, just the number of people that, find and start your sign up. You just want to make sure that people find out about this CTA that you have on your website. So yeah, just again, stay very lean, super simple, one primary metric, one secondary metric. So I'm going to take a concrete example. This is my Facebook profile. An example of a primary metric could be the percentage of users that go on their own profile page, or the percentage of users that goes on someone else's profile page. We want to see if people engage with each other, right? A secondary metric could be whether or not these people are adding pictures to their profile. Why? Because in addition to find out about, about their profile or their friend's profile, you probably want people to also start interacting with the pictures. So that's, again, a way to understand and make sure that the users are getting, additional discovery and value from the one feature that you pushed. There is that one thing called, so there is this one thing that is called the one feature, which has been quite popularized in the last years, which is if you can boil down, the entire success metric to one single feature for your product, it may be a very, very powerful way to align your entire organization behind a shared goal. This is the case of a couple of top-notch companies in the Valley. The one example that I really like is Slack. Slack has realized that if you hit a milestone of 2,000 messages inside a workspace, so inside an account, then there is a very high likelihood that the company will retain, 93% to be precise. That one metric is often referred as the activation metric, and it may be one of the the high-level goals that you can set for your organization. So if you are watching the video right now, you may just pause or take a few notes and try to run this exercise for yourself. And answer that basic questions. What does it take for the users of your product to realize the value of your product? What do you think is that one single action or features and metric that the people need to take to realize the value and stick around. It's a very hard exercise to run, but it's very I think it's very enlightening. So picking the right metric is kind of an art. It will come with experience. There are a couple of frameworks out there, including the Pyrite framework, activation, acquisition, retention, revenue, virality, the AARR. There are tons of other stuff. Just pick things around, be curious. There's lots of experience that also need to come into play, and I'm sure you will master that over time. So moving from the goals and the metrics, the next thing that comes really inside the metrics is the tracking. So how do you have this kind of like breakdown of the metrics so that you can measure them? This is what we call tracking. And it's basically, just the way to measure your metrics. So there are two main ways to track behaviors in today's modern product world. One way is called the implicit tracking. It covers solutions such as Google Analytics, Hotjar, Full Story. The other one is referred usually as explicit tracking. It covers Google Tag Manager, Segment, Amplitude, Mixpanel. Implicit tracking is also known as codeless event tracking, and this is the automatic event collection. It's aimed to really automatically integrate with with the interaction of the customers. It's usually just a JavaScript snippet that you have to put on your website, and once it's there, it just monitors things. Explicit tracking requires that you manually define the events and that you write a line of code when the event needs to be triggered, when a button is clicked, when a page is loaded, for instance. So it will help you to basically measure some very specific desired behavior and analyze this. The pros of the implicit tracking is that it's great for non-technical teams, and it will be very easy. You don't need to plan for it because it's usually automated and backward compatible, so retroactive. And the pros of the explicit tracking is that you will track things with a lot more context, a lot more information. And you'll also add some governance on that data so that if it flows in other systems, it won't break your system. So this is usually the data that you will get into a BI tool. So implicit tracking is really a great way to collect qualitative feedbacks. Heat maps are a great way to start to understand if you are onto something. Same for recordings. GA is great for URL views. It automatically tells you which page, based on the URL your visitors are visiting, and also the time they're spending on it. But really, you'll notice that by evolving in a product first or data-centric organization, you'll notice that explicit tracking remains the main way and the main accurate way to collect quantitative data today. So I'm going to deep dive into what brings the most accurate data and what you folks are most likely to interact with in your day-to-day, which is explicit tracking. So I'm going to focus on two things to elaborate on the explicit tracking. The first thing is the name of the event, which as you'll see, has a very significant role in that entire field. The second thing that you need to understand is what properties are and how they can be used and why they're so important in the explicit tracking world. So first, the names. Names are the description of the event and what's occurring. So if we go back to our example of a goal, which is to increase by 10% the acquisition rate, you may have a metric, which is the conversion rate. Then the event may be user sign up, right? This is like the action that the user has taken. Why it's important to be very aware of what even names are and their convention and their taxonomy is because they will show everywhere. They will show in the code. So your engineers in your company will expect to know what to write there because they are basically writing this line of code. But they're also going to show up in your dashboard. When you start to do your reporting and visualization, you need to know what the name of these trackings are. Otherwise, you won't be able to find them. So you need to be aware of what they are. To be thorough, you need to set a convention of name to make your data easy to understand. This is, in big companies, it's often done by the data department. In smaller companies, it may be the product team, it may be the product manager, maybe the founders, the early founders. There are three main syntaxes out there: snake case, all small letters, underscore, camel case, and title case. We recommend to use the snake case. It's all lowercase and it has no white space because it's the less likely format to break into your different systems, especially when these events are forwarded from one system to another. This is what usually ends up being into a tagging plan or a single source of truth. Here, what you can see is the name of the event and the description. Over time, as you add new events and as you have different systems, maybe you're using segments and mixed panel, whatever, you'll start to list this event because this is the only way you get to perform some analysis and know what is where and what means what. So it's very important that over time you keep a single source of truth. Again, it doesn't have to be over-engineered. A single spreadsheet to get started could be a very good solution for your company. Now I want to talk a little bit about the properties. So when you create an event with a name, you can attach some properties. And this is going to help you to understand the context in which the event was triggered or in which the people interacted with your features. So going back to our favorite example, if the event is that user has signed up, you may attach the source. Maybe you have like a button to sign up on different pages. So you're going to put the source, which pages they started with, the location, the country, or if they are coming from a paid campaign, maybe you're going to add the campaign, which is going to be extremely useful for the marketing teams to understand which campaign is performing best. You may also forward the user ID, which is maybe a way to reconcile the information if the user were logged in or logged out inside your database. So properties, again, are really adopted across the industries. Without them, you don't need them to get started, but as soon as you want to elaborate a little bit more about the context of the actions, you'll get to need them. Something that we're seeing in the latest years, which I've developed, is the tendency to try to automate the properties, which is often called enrichment. Segment has a really great integration with Clearbit, where people are naturally enriched with based on some of the information they provide, and this is already plugged into your properties. So let's say someone sign up with an email address which is acme.inc, then you may be able to use an enrichment tool to actually find out a lot of information. So acme.inc is a SaaS company. They're B2B. They have 44 employees, and they've raised 26 million. So it's the drawback of that is that it's pretty expensive still because it's very early, but good hope that in the future it will develop in the industry. So now that we've seen how to break down goals into metrics and tracking, the question is, what should you track first? And this is bringing us to our second step of the framework, which is what are the stages to the analytic epiphany if you're getting started. So the first thing I usually advise, new teams or new companies starting with analytics, kind of like ambition, is to start with a feature audit. So before you understand the main ways, the main goals that you have and whether or not you're about to reach them, it is very critical to understand where the customers are getting value. And this is basically pretty simple to do if you understand the directions that your customers take inside your product at the very high level. So this is called a feature audit. It was theorized by a couple of great companies, including Des at Intercom. Feature audit are a very simple way to visualize whether or not people are adopting your features and to which popularity. So if I take the feature in the top right corner, it's being used by all of your customers. So every single person that logged in has used it, and all of the time, meaning that every single session they're using your product for is a session where they navigate this feature. Any feature may have, maybe in 4 different places. It may be, very adopted by everyone, partially adopted by everyone, not very used. They can be used by few people a lot of the time, or few people by very often by few people. And in the 4th situation, what it tells you is that you may have some room to increase the discovery of your features, or you may have some room to increase the frequency, or you may just have, to kill your features or just pass. So if a feature has a limited adoption, really the four options you have is to kill it or to increase the adoption, the frequency, or deliberately improve it. If a feature is in the top right corner, it means that it's one of your killer features. You should probably not touch it, or if you touch it, you should be fairly, fairly confident with the extra value that you want to put on it. So maybe it's worth running a good test with a small batch of customers before you fully release the improvement. So now that you know kind of like which feature are being used in which proportion, you get a good understanding of where you can zoom in and what kind of like direction you should tackle in your product. So which feature you want to probably improve, or what are the next things that you want to add on top of what you currently do. And so the idea here is to understand how you can turn your product into like a set of features which is meaningful to measure and to analyze. This is what I'm saying here on the sign up. Let's say we want to improve the sign up. We think there is like an improvement possibility. I'm going to turn that into a bunch of steps and then have a crack on them. So a question that I often see is, what is a good retention? When should we start thinking about retention? And when is a good time to not think about retention, but go more in the weeds of the product and the usage of the product? So there's a basic rule, which is that if you look at a retention curve, so let's take the green line, which is the retention over time of your set of customers. If you see that the curve, so the number of customers left on your product day after day is really linearly decreasing, such as the green line, then it very likely means that you don't have a product market fit. It really likely means that people don't get enough value to naturally come back to your product. If you start to have a blue curve and you see, that bunch of people that after a few days don't come back, but then after a couple of days, you still have, decent portion of your customer set that comes back, then you're very, very likely on the track to reach your product market fit, or already reaching your product market fit. So the answer is based on whether or not you've hit that market fit, you should plot, on working on your retention and the retention features and the values that you can get to fit in to improve your retention. Otherwise, it would be basically too early. So this is easier said than done. It's really hard to work on the retention, and maybe it's going to be way more sticky curve than the one I mentioned. But that's okay, right? Just start with what you have. Get your retention out there. Get a first analysis on it, and then just decide if it's the right time to move on. Paige says that it's easier to expand user-wise and satisfaction-wise. This is just a tip that it's very tempting to work on, acquisition metrics and activation metrics and so on. But in the first instance, it's a lot about the retention in your product. So just a little tips about the prioritization there. So now that you've seen where to zoom in with the feature edit and you've decided to zoom in on a single feature that you think that makes sense, the third brick really that comes into play and that will help you to understand how to zoom in and improve the one thing that you have is the segmentation. So this is where you can use the properties to break down your tracking into meaningful segments. So we mentioned the platform could be one of the properties that you send. So you may analyze the behavior on desktop versus on mobile and find differences, and maybe find out that your responsive mobile version is less performing for X reasons and iterate on it. You may also work on the traffic of your source, which is also something that you can pass in the properties. You may find out that the source A customers coming from paid acquisitions are less sticky, and that's totally fine. Just because you're outreaching to these people and they don't, they probably don't need your product, they just saw your advertising. While the second source, which is much more organic, maybe, brings a set of customers which is much more likely to retain. So again, what you may find out here is that there is a need for your, content team, go-to-market team to work on channels which are more organic in the future. So once you're done with this first framework of starting with your goals, turning them into metrics, finding out how to track this stuff, and you got started to, with the 3 stages to really the analytic epiphany. The last thing for me today is going to be how you can make hypotheses and how you can find really this nugget and pocket of value within your product. So there are 2 simple steps here I would recommend. First is to identify the biggest opportunities in your product, then to make these opportunities against them and test them and see, because you're measuring the impact, if it's working or not. So this is really the hardest thing in analytics, and this is the thing that will take months, if not years, to come. It's really to get a feeling whether or not the metric you're looking at is good or not. So, we talk about conversion rate. Is a conversion rate of 2% good? Is it on average? Is it below average? There are some benchmark out there. To be fair, Google search will help you, but it's not going to be necessarily, perfect. Plus, not all these metrics are comparable. It depends a lot of the way you build up stuff. So my recommendation is talk with more senior people in your organization when you're reading this number and ask them how they feel about, the numbers you're reading. So I'm going to give a precise example of when a metric wasn't really good or wasn't really on the benchmark. So back then at N26, we had a sign up process where we would ask our customers to provide us their tax information, tax ID. And we noticed that there was quite a significant drop in the sign up on that step. So we made 2 hypotheses, which was that, finding a tax ID is kind of hard, especially if you're signing up on mobile with N26, you maybe in the train or in the street. And our hypothesis was that customers were discouraged and would drop because of that, number they would have to provide, or that they were home, they would look for the ID, but then, maybe the phone was locked and the progress would be lost, whatever. So we made an hypothesis, which is which was to make this field optional, and that people could complete the sign up without the tax ID. And then we would ask customers to come back and provide that in the settings. It proved to be extremely successful. It really, really bumped up the conversion rate. And so after testing it was decided to be implemented. So last but not least, I'm going to try to do a recap. At the product team level, maybe there is always a room to tie the incentive to hard metrics. Try to get your organization more data driven. So assigning metrics to a team, rewarding them, celebrating when metrics are hit is kind of a good practice. Remember a time where we had dashboard on the wall at Zalando. It was really a great way to get everyone focused on the metric. The definition of done when you're doing product development is kind of also key. Some stuff that I've seen in the past is we've made sure that epics were not closed or not done unless we've performed some analysis on the data and circulate this data around. So maybe just change the definition of done. Things are not supposed to be closed until they're analyzed is a very easy way to make sure that some analysis comes together with your releases. Again, I mentioned that a few times, more data doesn't mean better data. I've seen way too often companies pack with data, plus it's something you pay for. Usually with the modern tools, you pay for the set of data you are using, and it really doesn't help to approach this data. So if you stick around with me up to this point, congrats. Hopefully you've learned useful tips and information. And if you started to apply that to your product, hopefully you've made some great progress towards building a great product with your data. So the process is pretty simple. Think about the goals, turn that into tracking, start broad, narrow on specific use cases. And then once you are familiar with that, it's all about making hypotheses. If you want to keep in touch with me, I'm always happy to help on product analytics related topics. You can drop me an email at enzoavigo@gmail.com. Again, if you're keen to understand what we're building at June, or you want to beta test the product, I would be more than happy to have you bit.ly/nocodeanalytics to sign up to our our newsletter to hear about when we drop the product. Thanks so much for listening to me. That's all for me. Big thanks to Product School for having me today, and goodbye from Paris. Thanks.